Hi, Karen Curry Parker here. Welcome to Quantum Human Design Level 2. In this class, we're going to be looking at the throat center. The throat center is an incredibly powerful and unique center in the human design chart. It's the throat center that is really, in essence, a gearbox. It regulates our energy for creativity and manifesting. It determines to a large degree type when we look at how type is configured. It is the center for metabolism. So when we fail to live aligned with our true essence, it's a place where, if we're not careful, we can burn ourselves out. It is the place where, most importantly, we give words to things. If you think about language, and the power of language and the ability to transmit through language, which is such an essential aspect of the human story and the human condition, it's language that lifts us up or drags us down. It's language that translates divine spark into the human experience, which is why, for example, when we look at the manifestor type, and we recognize that the manifestor or the initiator in quantum human design has a nonverbal connection to divine spark, that creativity skips a step to a certain degree because it moves so fast. It goes direct from divine spark to action. But for the rest of us, and actually the manifestor has to figure out how to translate that into language to inform as part of the strategy, right? But for the rest of us, our big challenge is putting into words the translation of that divine spark so that we can then act or react to what is being said. It's language, words that hold meaning, that trigger meaning based on our conditioning, and it's language that allows us to share. It's language that begins the process of translating divine spark into the human story and consequently moves us into some kind of action, whether it's an action that comes as a result of a verbal invitation or something to respond to. I love the word devar in Hebrew. The word devar in Hebrew is the word for word, but it's also the word for thing, meaning things don't become things until we give them a name, a word. And it's such a vital part of recognizing how we translate our divinity, our soul self, into our human story. Now, that's very abstract and big and kind of holistic in terms of understanding the power of the throat center. In a much more grounded way, the throat center is the center for communication and, of course, manifestation. And it becomes the center for manifestation because it's through language that we begin the process of creating. It's also the center for manifestation because the way in which the throat center is configured is going to tell us a lot about somebody's manifesting style. If the throat center is connected to a motor, and there are 4 motors in the chart: the will center, the sacral, the emotional solar plexus, and the root, and I have a slide for that for you later. If the throat center is connected to a motor directly through a defined channel, then you've got manifestor type energy. Now, that's going to be true, of course, for the manifestor or the initiator type, as well as for the manifesting generator, the time bender types. So these two types have a motorized throat, which means these two types have a little bit of a different ability to manifest through initiating. Certainly, you know, the manifestor type or the initiator type has the ability to initiate because they're translating divine spark into action. The manifesting generator can do the same, but still only in response because that divine sacral takes precedence. So the manifesting generator, once they get something to respond to, can then go about very quickly taking action as well because of the motorized throat. The generators, the projectors, and the reflectors will have a non-motorized throat. Obviously, the reflector is always going to have an open throat. Projectors and generators are going to have either an open throat or a non-motorized throat, which means when you don't have a motor to the throat, when you are a generator, projector, or a reflector, you are definitely going to be creating much more in a responsive way. Not responsive meaning the outer reality is going to give you much more solid and concrete cues and clues from which you're going to take your incentive or take your awareness into what you need to do next. So that dance between what we'll loosely call manifesting, initiating in human design versus responding, and I'll call that responding category. That's going to be either generated or invitation for the projector, or of course waiting out the 28 days for the reflector. There's a certain amount of flow that happens more in a very different way for the generator, projector, and reflector versus the manifester and the manifesting generator, because of the difference in the way in which the throat is configured. That oftentimes looks like speed, that the manifester and the manifesting generator can move more quickly. I would like to invite us, as we explore this more deeply, to take timing and speed out of the equation. In the end, we all create, and we all create to a certain degree at the same speed. It's just the path that we take is different. So the manifestor and the manifesting generator have a path that looks on the front end like it's more fast, it's quicker. But in reality, if we really take a bigger step back and we look at the end point over a span of time, everybody's actually creating at the same speed. Everybody's going to end up at the same point at the end. It's just the path and the way in which we get there is different. The manifestor is going to have sparks of energy and rest. The manifesting generator is going to be leaping. The generator is going to be more slow and steady, wins the race. The projector is going to be more in collaboration with the bigger events. And the reflector is going to be, of course, doing the same thing, taking their time and reflecting through the bigger aspects of it. But in the end, if we looked at a longer cycle of time rather than in the moment, everybody's manifesting. Everybody's creating, and to a certain degree, everybody's creating at the same pace. It's just the way in which they go about creating is different. So I really want to be clear about this, because I do think sometimes in the traditional language of human design, when we use the term manifester or manifesting, or even in the conversations we have about deliberate creation and consciousness, we talk a lot about manifesting. And I think there's a certain mythology that says, the quote unquote slower types, the generator, the projector, reflector, don't manifest at the same speed. And I would argue with you that's not true. We all manifest. We all manifest. We have different ways in which we manifest, but we all manifest. And I think that's an important piece to bring into your conversations with your clients, and certainly to look at with yourself. We are so conditioned to think that speed is the only way at which we create, that we neglect to take a longer term view, and that oftentimes causes us to get bogged down in the lack of speed, and we don't look then at the alignment with right timing, and we get all bungled up with the whole timepiece. Everybody manifests. And the nature of throat configuration and knowing how to consciously use the power of high frequency language, which is so much a part of what quantum human design is about, gives us the capacity to align in a much more easy way with right timing, and to be at peace with right timing, to not resist and push against right timing, because it's the pushing against timing that actually burns us out. It's the pushing against alignment, because we've decided what the timeline should be like, that keeps us out of harmony with the essence of who we are. So the throat center is a center that is also about energy modulation and regulation. It is the seat of the thyroid, which is the master gland for the endocrine system. So if we are pushing, meaning if we are not using the energy of our throat center correctly, if we're not aligning our energy with our unique configuration in the chart, if we're pushing against ourselves, then we're not modulating our energy well, and we're putting ourselves at risk for burnout. If we are aligning ourselves and using our energy correctly according to the way in which our chart is configured, then we increase the health and the well-being of our throat center, and we are then able to stay healthy, sustain the endocrine system, avoid things like thyroid collapse, endocrine collapse, adrenal fatigue, and keep ourselves healthier and sustainable over time. The open throat center, and again, remember, generators and projectors and always reflectors, all reflectors will always have an open throat. Generators and projectors can have either a non-motorized throat, meaning it will be connected to the ajna, the spleen, the ji, or they'll have an open throat. And to a certain degree, there are similar themes between the open throat and the non-motorized throat, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Both the open throat and the non-motorized throat needs recognition and attention. The generator has to respond. The projector needs the recognition. Those two pieces, the responding and the needing the recognition for the non-motorized or the open throat, can do two things. Number one, it can make somebody really desperate to be seen. And so that struggle for recognition and attention can become dysfunctional and ultimately exhausting if somebody's in an unhealthy environment where they're not being loved and valued for who they are. So if you have somebody who has an open throat or somebody who has a non-motorized throat, which is a little bit less vulnerable but still vulnerable, one of the things that they will often tell you is they don't feel seen and heard. And sometimes they're not seen and heard. It's kind of the nature of the energy that the open throat especially is designed to sit in silence and observe and be activated through recognition and response when the timing is right and when their wisdom is being needed and valued. So to a certain degree, that open throat and that non-motorized throat, but especially the open throat, has a similar theme as a projector. This starts to explain why sometimes you get people in your practice who say are generators, but who recognize or identify, with the projector piece. They don't understand why they're not projectors because they feel like projectors. And sometimes what's causing them to feel like a projector is that open throat, that not feeling recognized and heard, not waiting for the recognition or not waiting for something to respond to, and blurting stuff out into the world. The same thing that I say for the projector or for the orchestrator is true for the open throat or the non-motorized throat. When people have a non-motorized throat or an open throat, for them to engage correctly in the dance of life and for them to share the wisdom and the value of who they are, it serves them well to wait for the recognition and the invitation, because that recognition, that thing to respond to, or that attention that they get is the cue and the clue that they're in the right place with the right people who value them. And that's huge. That's such an important thing to understand and remember, because if you're not in the right place and you're trying to get that recognition and nobody's hearing you, or they're taking your words and running with them and claiming them as your own, then you're not with the right people. And it's not your fault that you're not seen or heard. It's that your value piece perhaps isn't aligned and you're in a situation where you're not allowing yourself to be valued and seen for who you are. So it's really vital when we have clients that are struggling with that to really explore whether they're in an environment that really is recognizing their value and whether perhaps there's some self-worth work that needs to be done in order for them to hold their value strong enough to be able to be seen and recognized. Because of course, when you start to get into this cycle of not feeling seen and heard, it can start to affect your self-worth. And then of course, you become more and more invisible because the self-worth begins to decline, and then there's less recognition, less attention, and then oftentimes a real struggle to manage that hurt that comes from not feeling seen and heard. Now, the struggle for recognition and attention can sometimes devolve into dysfunctional energy patterns that involve really trying to be seen and heard when you have this open throat, non-motorized throat configuration. So it's not unusual for people who have this kind of a configuration to do things, extreme things sometimes, to be seen. This can be the class clown in the back of the room at school, the kid that's always doing inappropriate things to be seen. That's oftentimes the struggle for recognition and attention. It can be sometimes a motivation and a driver for trying to create something that you don't really want in your life, but that you feel or you have a mistaken belief that, well, if I get this thing, this position, this experience, this whatever, that I'll be seen. And being seen becomes a motivation rather than being aligned as the real motivation for life and life fulfillment. The open throat, in its highest expression, is designed to speak the truth. Sometimes, though, because it'll take in the energy of the people around it, sometimes it blurts out the truth when the timing is not right. Because even though the throat center is technically not a pressure center, I do find that people who have an open throat will often tell me that at a certain point that throat gets under so much pressure they just have to talk. And certainly, there is a real need sometimes to burn off steam with the open throat and the non-motorized throat, to just have a space in your life where you can just go blah, blah, blah and talk, not for any other reason or not for any other motivation other than you just need to move the energy that builds up there. So it's good to help people who have an open throat or a non-motorized throat understand that sometimes they really just need to talk. They just need space to just let it all out because they've been holding back and that energy's been building up all day long, and they just need to let it ramble. My husband has an undefined throat, and I now understand that at the end of the day, I need to just create space for him at the end of the day to just talk. That this isn't talk that has any purpose or direction necessarily. It's just after sitting, all day long at work or in front of the computer or wherever, energy builds up for him here, and he's got to move that energy to be able to get back in touch with his essence, which becomes a really important thing to pay attention to when we look at relationship dynamics, because sometimes the open throat and the non-motorized throat really just needs to talk for the sake of moving energy, and there's a very different kind of communication that happens. There's the holding space for the moving of energy versus I need to have the need to have a really serious dialogue that's intentional and deliberate and involves communicating a feeling or an emotion or a thought or an idea. So recognizing that the open throat and to a certain degree the non-motorized throat has two ways of communicating. One that's just talking to burn off steam, and two, actually needing to have a concrete conversation is very distinctly different. And if you're in a relationship with someone with an open throat or a non-motorized throat, really being mindful of what kind of conversation is this? Is this an energy moving dialogue, or is this an actual dialogue where somebody is speaking about what they need to talk about? Obviously, because with the undefined throat or the non-motorized throat, there is no motor. The recognition and the attention is important because it gives somebody access to energy. It gives them access to what in traditional human design we call manifesting energy. I prefer to think of it as just creative energy or energy in general. That the recognition and the attention activates the energy in the chart. So for the generator and the projector and for the reflector, recognition and attention activates the energy, and that energy activation lets you know, provided it's the right attention and the right activation, you're being recognized for your value. That recognition lets you know you're in the right place, and this is the right place for you to expend your energy, to use your energy so that it will support you in creating more energy, not less. The defined throat center is going to tell you a lot about your client. It's going to tell you a lot about what your client is here to communicate about. And it gives you some interesting insights to support your client in also feeling heard and seen for who they are. So in the next section, in the next few slides, I'm going to go through the throat connections and the themes that they have so that you can better support your clients in looking at how they can better use the definition of their throat center. So the first throat connection we're going to look at is the ajna to the throat. And anybody that has their ajna connected to their throat, when you look at this configuration, you know this by the way can be any of these three channels or more than these three channels. I mean, you have these three channels or two channels or one channel, but anytime you have a defined channel from the ajna to the throat, is somebody who's whose throat is configured to speak their mind, to share their thoughts, to share their ideas, their insights, to use the power of their language to open up people to possibility. The thing that's important to understand about this particular configuration is that this is what's called a projected element in the chart. When you have a connection to the throat, or sometimes and we talk more about this in level 3, lower down in the chart as well, but if you have a connection to the throat that's not motorized, so ajna to the throat, ji to the throat, spleen to the throat, these are what are called projected elements in the chart, meaning even if you have definition here, so if you have a defined throat and a defined ajna, because it's not motorized, it's not connected to the will, the sacral, the spleen, the will, the sacral, the emotional solar plexus, and the root. That means this is an aspect of the chart that needs to be recognized or invited to be shared. So if you have a client who has a defined ajna to the throat, or if you have a defined ajna to the throat, you need to wait for recognition to speak your mind. And of course, that makes total sense if you think about it. We don't like it when people just share their opinions or their thoughts, or they tell their stories without being asked, right? It's an energy that doesn't feel good if it's not recognized or invited. The throat center to the spleen gives people a voice that says, I sense. This is a deep ability to sense when timing is aligned, when timing is right, or to have the intuitive awareness that something needs to be done about something. And again, the challenge of this is that this is a projected element. These are people who oftentimes know. They know things. They don't even know how they know that they know, but they know. And when they try to share their knowing, if people aren't ready and they're not being recognized, they're sharing this precious wisdom out into the world and people aren't hearing it. So this awareness that the splenic center, the spleen to the throat, gives people a deep intuitive ability to sense when timing is right or when right action needs to be taken. The throat connection to the identity center here is actually, first of all, a very vulnerable connection. If you see this, if you're doing a reading for a child, or you have, you're doing a relationship reading and there's some really difficult energy perhaps, or themes happening in the relationship, this particular configuration, having a G to the throat, makes somebody very vulnerable to criticism. When people speak out of the G to the throat, and again, this is a projected element, they really literally are who or what they talk about. They are speaking from the heart of who they are, literally. And this voice that comes from the heart of who they are can be very vulnerable. It's a voice that can be very vulnerable to criticism. And I always think of this as kind of being what I call the turtle configuration. If somebody has this in their chart and they do receive criticism, oftentimes people with this energy will retreat deep within themselves, and it'll be a long time before they take a risk to come back out and share themselves with the world again. So just recognizing that, again, this is a projected element. And all of these projected elements, whether it's the spleen to the throat or the ajna to the throat, all of these projected elements, that recognition, waiting for the recognition or the invitation to share, is a protective thing. It's not a thing that should instill bitterness in someone. It's protective, because what it really says is that you're not going to be wasting your energy sharing yourself with people who aren't ready to hear who you are and what you have to bring forward. It allows you to share with the right people, and recognizing that invitation and that recognition is the key that unlocks right opportunities, right possibilities, right relationships is huge. And if you can get people to shift that perspective, to really start holding on to the gem of who they are, and to start telling themselves, I'm not going to share what I have, what I know, who I am, with people who aren't going to value it. So I'm going to wait for the recognition and the invitation, because that's my sign that I'm in the right place with the right people. So as I've been talking about, there are 4 motors in the human design chart: the sacral, the root, the solar plexus, and the will center. When we have a throat connection to a motor, we have, of course, manifest energy. So we've got either a manifestor and initiator type, or a time bender manifesting generator type. So we want to look too, though, at these connections as well. There are some interesting challenges that can come with these connections. Anytime you see an ego or the will center to the throat, you're going to have somebody that's going to talk about themselves. They're going to be talking about their experience. They're going to be talking about what they have. They're going to be talking about the resources they have access to. And because this is manifested energy, they don't need for an invitation from you, thank you very much. They can just share it. But the pushback here is that even though they can share at will, if they're not in the right place or with the right people, it still can cause people to push away, to be pushed away by this. This is very intense energy. We will say to people who have this configuration, oh, you're so in your ego. And oftentimes people with this configuration will shut down because they become afraid of being in their ego and not recognizing that their ego is here to serve. The me, I voice that comes from the will is a direction giving energy. It's a resource giving energy. It's a leadership energy. And it is an energy that can inspire people to follow, can give people information to increase value in the world. And so, one of the things you want to help people understand if they have this configuration is that it's okay for them to talk about themselves. In fact, it's important. And if people are pushed away for whatever reason, that's a reflection of the other person's lack of value. And also to recognize that not everybody can do what you can do when you have a will center to the throat. That definition of willpower to the throat is very, very powerful. And it takes its cues and clues from its own sense of value and from the resources that it has. And that will center is literally willpower, and not everyone works and operates from that same energy. And always important to tell people with the will to the throat, be gentle with the rest of the world, because not everybody can do what you do in the way in which you do it. Everybody can create, everybody can manifest. I want you to get that piece, but we do it differently. And certainly the will center to the throat does give it a certain amount of push, because you can speak into the push and take action on the push. But don't forget, the will center works to rest. We haven't talked about that yet. We haven't gotten to the will center, but the potential for burnout here, if somebody with this configuration doesn't also take consistent cycles of rest, we'll talk about that more when we get to the will center, is huge. So this is a powerful but yet also potentially vulnerable configuration. And again, when there's too much pushing with this, then this energy can sometimes push people away. So finding that healthy balance between the me and the we is a really important piece to pay attention to with the will center to the throat. And again, recognizing that this is the voice of the will to the throat is me and I. That's how they talk. And that's not an ego problem. That's the nature of this definition. The solar plexus to the throat has the voice of I feel. These are people who can talk about their feelings, people who will express their emotional energy, and people who, to a certain degree, can lift the room up or bring the room down when they, and recognizing and being aware of the quality of emotional energy that they are offering is very important. This can be very creative energy. This can be very important energy, because this energy can bring people into a conversation about emotional frequencies, creative frequencies, possibilities, and explorations around feelings. And it is manifested energy. So the challenge here with this is that because the emotional energy has waves and flows, somebody with this configuration isn't always going to be able to create all the time. They're going to have ebbs and flows in their creative energy, ebbs and flows in how their energy works, ebbs and flows in how they feel, and that is all normal. And to not get locked into getting stuck in the moment if the energy flow isn't what somebody's hoping it to be. And again, when we talk about the solar plexus later, this will make a lot more sense. The root center to the throat, which is a little bit, it always is a circuitous route. The root never gets directly to the throat like the will center and the emotional solar plexus. It always has to go through another center. This center also, the root center also has pulses of energies, not quite as extreme as the emotional solar plexus. So it definitely, this is adrenaline energy. It's doing energy. When the pulse to do is on, the energy to do can usually be pretty intense. When the pulse for energy is off in the root, then it's difficult sometimes to get stuff done that feels like you have to really push against your own adrenaline system to get things going. But when the timing is right and the feeling is right, there's doing this here. And of course, the sacral to the throat through the 3420 is the archetype. That's the channel that comes off the left hand side and curves up towards the throat. That channel is the only channel that gets directly from the sacral to the throat. All the other connections from the sacral to the throat have to go through other centers. So that 3420 energy is the archetype of the manifesting generator. These are not, by the way, the only ways that the sacral can get to the throat. It can get through the throat, through the spleen. It can get through the throat, up through the ego. If it goes to the spleen, over to the will center to the throat. It can go down to the root and up and over to the solar plexus. So sometimes you have to look at, if you have a manifesting generator or a time bender, you got to kind of look at, well, where is the sacral and how does it get to the throat? And sometimes it doesn't get to the throat, but another motor does. Bottom line here is when we get the sacral connected to the throat, we have a throat that is going to talk about work and relationships and wants to talk about, what do I do? What's my work? What's my relationship status? This is an energy that's going to lend itself towards talking about sacral themes, which we'll talk about later when we talk about the sacral work and relationships. If we look at the voices or the gates of the throat, it's also going to tell us a lot about what somebody talks about. So I'm not going to go deep into these gates, but I want you to just listen to what the voices of these different gates lend to the configuration of the throat center. So the gate 62 gives the throat center, somebody with a defined throat, a practical voice. The gate 23 says it gives the voice the power to change how people think. The gate 56 is the gate of the storyteller, so people who have the gate 56 configured on their throat have an aspect of what they communicate that's rooted in storytelling. The gate 35 is the voice of experience, so people with this gate 35 defined. By the way, this is true whether the throat is open or defined. I want to take a little break here and talk about something that I touched on briefly when we looked at openness and definition, but this is a question that comes up a lot when people think about centers. If you have an open center with a gate on it, a hanging gate attached to it, there are two things to understand. With the open throat and a hanging gate, first of all, that means that that theme of that gate is always going to be lived out in relationship. That hanging gate is kind of like a magnet. So if you could imagine, this isn't actually, this on this particular side, this image isn't actually correct. If you just had a hanging 35 on a throat center, the throat center would not be defined, right? Because it takes a full channel to create definition in a center. So this technically, if this was a real chart, you would be looking at this chart and this chart would have an open throat with the gate 35 hanging. That gate 35 is like a little magnet. It's always looking for the 36 on the other side. So anywhere in the chart where we have hanging gates, half a channel defined, those half channels are like little magnets, and they are always looking for what we call their electromagnetic mate. So they're always in quest through relationship for the other side of the channel. So this 35 out in the world is always looking for the 36. It's attracted to the 36. It's an electromagnetic attraction, literally. So that means the 35 theme in this particular chart would be lived out in its relationships. It would be attracted to the 36. It would give that relationship the flavor of the whole channel and the throat and the solar plexus at the other end of it. And that relationship would explore the theme and would cause this person with the 35 to really live the theme of the 35 through its relationships. Now, because relationships change and people's experiences and there's openness in the 36, the electromagnetic is open, that's going to give this person a lot of variability, but it's also going to give this person a theme of exploring the 35 in relationships. Because the throat would be open and the 35 is hanging there, it also means that when the throat gets under pressure in relationship, because definition now comes into the throat through conditioning in the relationship, meaning if you have an open throat with a hanging gate and you get into a relationship with someone who carries the electromagnetic, and that relationship gives you the flavor of definition. It doesn't actually give you definition, but you'll experience a sort of a more subtle experience of definition. It'll feel as if you are defined, not quite as intensely, but it can feel as if you are defined. That open center with one gate hanging off of it is kind of like a funnel. So anytime that center gets under pressure, it pushes everything through that hanging gate theme. So anytime, let's say if this person had an open throat with the gate 35 hanging, anytime they got around throat energy, it would push through their 35. And that 35 then becomes a very powerful theme. So you want to look at, when you're looking at a chart, if it has an open center with one gate hanging off of it, recognizing that that one gate is going to be a very significant theme. So if this person has the gate 35 defined and that's all they have on their throat center defined, they have a lifetime soul curriculum of exploring the theme of the 35 through that open throat, through relationship, and they're constantly exploring, how do I share my experience with the world, because that single hanging gate is a big theme. Now, if you start to get more than one gate attached to an open center, then it becomes a little bit different, because now you have a couple of different themes playing out here, which means you have a couple of different configurations, and that theme is not quite as intense as if when you have just one gate defined on an open center. The gate 12 is all about articulation and transformation. So this is a voice that, when the mood is right, has the ability to speak and transform. And when the mood is not right, this is actually a voice that can be quite shy. The gate 45 is a gate of leadership, is one of the gates of leadership in the chart. These are people who, with their throat energy, want to speak and use their language to lead and to teach. This is also a teaching energy. The gate 33 is the voice of the past. Usually people with this energy are witnesses. People will tell you, if you have this gate defined, people will tell you everything. You bear witness to people's stories and their secrets. And you have the ability, through listening and bearing witness, and through looking retrospectively at your own experience, to share the stories of what has come before. So this is a different kind of a storytelling energy. This is a storytelling energy that is about telling the story of what's happened before, the voice of the past. The gate 8 has a lot of pressure on it. This is a very deeply creative energy. This is the voice that says, I am. And if you really think about the power of the sentence, I am defines not only who we perceive ourselves to be, what we say we are gives direction to our voice. It gives direction to our lives. It programs the monopole. So this particular gate and this entire channel, the 1-8, is an incredibly vital and important energy that gives direction to the voice and gives direction to others. So again, an energy that, when used correctly, can really unify people around a definition and a point of manifestation, by defining who we are and, of course, who they are individually. The gate 31 is another leadership energy. This is not the same quality of energy as the 45. The 45 has sort of a natural leadership. People see it. When people with the 45 walk into the room, we all know the leader has arrived. It's the gate of the king or the gate of the queen. The gate 31 is really more democratic leadership. It's a leadership that is recognized by others and put into place. So it still is a leadership energy. It's a subtle distinction between the 45 and the 31, but certainly the gate 31 wants to lead. They want to be a leader, to move a group of people through something. The gate 20 has the voice of I unify. This is an energy of power, but it's power that brings people together around common ideas. And the gate 16 is enthusiasm. So people with the gate 16 often inspire other people with their enthusiasm. Affirmations for the defined throat center include, I speak with great responsibility and know the true source of my words. I allow others to have a voice, and I use my words to invite others to share. Affirmations for the open throat center. My words are heard best when I am invited to speak. I save my words for people who truly desire to hear my point of view and insights. I wait for the right people to ask me and value my words. So again, when we look at traditional human design, the people with the undefined or the non-motorized throat really struggle for recognition, and it's a really important exploration when you're looking at the deconditioning process or coaching someone to really look at, is the driver for what you're doing part of a struggle for recognition? Are you doing what you're doing because you want to be seen and heard, or because you really want to do it? And being able to recognize that maybe what's driving someone with a non-motorized throat or an open throat is the need for recognition, and learning to take that out of the motivation and getting people back aligned with doing what you want to do because it brings you joy is important. So sometimes that struggle for recognition can really cause an energy depletion because people are not really aligning but trying desperately to get attention, and that desperation for attention can be exhausting. The quantum purpose of the throat center is to use language in an empowering, loving, and creative way to stimulate and initiate sustainable, abundant possibilities. So, the quantum name for the throat center is the activation center. It's the power of language that stimulates and initiates sustainable and abundant possibilities. So, understanding the power of words is crucial for helping us learn to use language deliberately and consciously to cultivate high frequencies, sustainable and abundant frequencies of energies that lead to new abundant possibilities. In our next class, we're going to be exploring the Identity Center, the center for love and direction, and the seat of the magnetic monopole. And we're going to be looking at how do we use our energy to consciously program the monopole to take us in a direction that is really worthy of who we are.